Are you looking for ideas to get the more precise piecing? Well, stick with me. We're going to go over piecing techniques today. Hi, I'm Roberta from Quilt Crafters Corner. Now, I've been quilting for a long time, and this is one of those things that it's really just practice, practice, practice. But I want to give you some ideas and some techniques to help you get that better piecing. Now, the first tip or idea that I have for you is cutting. Precise cutting can sometimes mean the difference of a 1/16 of an inch. So let me show you what I'm talking about. When you put your ruler down on your fabric, make sure the edge of your fabric is on the line. If you go off the edge of the fabric, you're losing a 1/16 of an inch each time you cut. So this starts to add up over time. So make sure when you line your ruler up and you want to get that precise cut, make sure that you are right there, your line is right there on the edge of the fabric, and then cut. If you don't, you could lose that 1/16 of an inch, and if you do that every time, you're going to lose a 1/16 of an inch every time you make a cut. Accurate seams is my second tip for you. It's always difficult to get that 1/4 inch seam, especially if we started sewing, doing clothes where it's 5/8 of an inch and you're used to that 5/8. Now with a 1/4 inch, you have a much smaller seam. Now remember, when you go to do that 1/4 inch, you should always check your seams until you get really comfortable with sewing that 1/4 inch seam. Now, what I use is I have a little measuring ruler right next to my machine. I keep this next to my machine, and it's got 1/4 inch marked on there. So I can just line this up on my fabric and check it and make sure, am I a 1/4 inch? Is it a true 1/4 inch? So you want to make sure that you have this lined up just right and you've got that 1/4 inch seam. This is a really good way. I always keep this by my machine. It just makes it easier. And that way, if I'm off just a little bit, I can adjust. And then if it helps you any, mark your machine, whether you want to do it permanently or with just a piece of painter's tape, lay on the bed of the machine. This really helps. I find this really helps, especially with new quilters. I give them that painter's tape and we mark it, and I show them how to keep their edge of their fabric lined up against that tape, and it really helps them get that better 1/4 inch seam. My next tip for you is slow down. We all have a tendency to want to go fast. Zoom, 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 zoom. So slow down until you master that 1/4 inch seam. As the machine is pulling that fabric through the machine, if it's going too fast, you can lose control, and that's a real easy way to get inconsistent seams. The other thing you need to remember is a 1/4 inch seam is not hitting that right feed dog. It's only pulling on the left. So can you imagine, it's not pulling it straight, it's pulling it crooked. So you really have to hold on to that material, your fabric, going through the machine to keep it nice and even. So pay attention to that. Just slow down a little bit and watch until you get a nice rhythm, and then you can speed up a little bit. But until you master that 1/4 inch seam, I would suggest just slow down. The next tip I want to talk about is ironing. Now, we call it ironing, and that's when we learn to iron our shirts and things like that. But there's a difference between ironing and pressing. Ironing, you're moving the iron along the top of the fabric, and this can stretch and distort your fabric. So when you're quilting, use pressing, and that's just you're lifting the iron up and putting it down. I set my seams first, so I would take this to the iron and I would just put my iron down on it. And then when I go to open this up, I will just quickly finger press it like that and then put my iron down on it and then do my next one. If you take that iron and you're doing this, your fabric's going to start stretching and going every which way. See how that stretches? So you want to make sure you're pressing, not ironing. The next tip I have for you is cutting your pieces just a little larger than they need to be. Now let me explain. This is a half square triangle, and because it is cut on the bias, this stretches, and this can stretch really and distort your fabrics in all different ways. So especially when I'm doing half square triangles, I always cut them larger and trim them down because I want my seam, my points, to come out at on each of those diagonals. It makes for a nicer seam and you don't lose your points. Now, I did 150 videos last year on a variety of blocks and they were most beginner blocks, just practicing those seams and those bias cuts and things like that. Those are over on my Facebook page and the Facebook group Quilter Swarm if you want to see them. It is much easier to trim these down than to add fabric. So until you get comfortable with doing half square triangles and things like that, I would highly recommend that you cut these bigger, trim them down to the true size. You'll be much happier with the results that you get. My next tip is about reading your instructions, especially if you're working from a pattern. Now, I usually go through and read it 1 or 2 times and really study it and understand what they're trying to tell me, how they have created this pattern or block or whatever it is that I'm working on. It's really important to understand what they're trying to tell you, and learning quilt terminology is really important when you get to these steps, especially if it's a pattern that you've never made before or a concept you don't understand. Really understanding the pattern is important. The other thing that I do for this is test blocks. Make a block out of another material, something that you don't care too much about, but just to test out what they're telling you to do, especially if you're struggling with part of the pattern. Make that test block. Work with it, because once you start to understand what they're trying to tell you in the pattern, it makes it much easier. And besides that, those test blocks make great doll quilts or wall hangings. So let's talk about the next thing. The next one is called chain piecing, and this is where you're piecing units together in a chain. Now, here is an example of chain piecing, and this is just units and I just, you just start sewing them through the machine like that. It's satisfying to sit there and see how long of a chain you can make with your chain piecing. And this is a real easy way to kind of check, make sure you've got that true 1/4 inch seam, and make sure that everything's lining up and that it's all working really smoothly. This is going to save you a lot of time of not having to rip out those seams if you make a mistake. If you find that your seams are too big, then you're going to have to take that out and redo it. Now, starch is another thing that people either love it or they hate it. They don't want to do it. So I do it when I want to get that precision, that exact crisp pattern and a nice seam, and I know that everything's going to fit together nicely. Now, there's many types of starch that you can use. There's grocery store starch, there's best press quilters, some quilters just love that, and then there's the homemade versions. whatever works for you. This is really a test, a trial and error. And one of the things that I've gone to that I particularly like is vodka. And it doesn't have to be expensive vodka. It can be cheap vodka. The cheaper the better. And there's many recipes out on the internet that you can find for that type of starch. The one I particularly care for is actually getting the vodka that's made with potatoes and use that potato starch. It seems to stay crisper and nicer for me longer, especially when I'm working on a project. Now, the reason why I do that is because it just makes those pieces go together much nicer, and they ride along that edge of the 1/4 inch foot better. So note, grocery store starch has either corn or wheat or I'm not sure about the third one, but that sometimes can attract bugs. So once you get your project done, make sure you wash it and get that starch out of the fabric so it doesn't attract silverfish, bugs, all of that thing. Okay? And the last thing, and probably the most important thing, remember, this is supposed to be fun. So if you start stressing yourself out about your seams aren't perfect, and just stop, take a breath, and just go, okay. Sometimes we just need to stop and take a breath and go, okay, this is not, why am I making this so hard? This isn't supposed to be hard. This is supposed to be relaxing, enjoyable, build self-confidence, things like that. This is why we quilt. We love that, not only a challenge of putting things together, but also the I made that, reaction. So I want to remind you, relax, enjoy the process, have fun with this process. This is supposed to be something that you love doing. Besides that, it's been proven that this hobby of quilting reduces the onset of dementia and Alzheimer's, just because you're busy keeping your mind working, which is really important. So I want to help you understand that this is all about relaxing and enjoying this process. So I'd like to encourage you to go and try some of these ideas. See if this helps with your piecing skills. What worked best for you? Let me know. Leave me a comment below. I'm here to help. Come over to the Facebook group Quilters Swarm and join. All 150 quilt blocks are there for you to watch. I'm really excited about the direction that I'm taking the Quilters Swarm in. So if you want to stay current with all that news, come join Quilters Swarm. If you made it this far in the video, thank you. Thanks for watching, and please like and subscribe here on YouTube. Until next time, keep quilting.